when a leader dies in a highly vertical organization, two things can happen. Either there's a smooth succession, or we see competitions among top commanders.
So getting rid of the head does not solve security problems as I think people would hope.
Probably not. Mexican history has shown generally decapitation strategy has brought higher levels of fragmentation and hardly were successful in dismantling a criminal organization.
Conflicts of Interest, brought to you by ACLED.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Clionadh Raleigh, and this is an emergency podcast on the state of security in Mexico. I'm here with our absolutely wonderful analyst, Sandra. Sandra, please introduce yourself.
I am Sandra Pellegrini. I'm senior analyst covering Latin America and the Caribbean at ACLED. I think I've been in that role for several years. And yes, things unfolded in Mexico yesterday.
They certainly did. Nemesio Oseguera, also known as El Mencho, the head of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, died on Sunday in an operation by Mexican security forces in coordination with U.S. authorities in Tapalpa, Jalisco state. He was 59 years old, and he had turned the CJNG into Mexico's powerful crime group, the two most powerful crime groups, alongside the Sinaloa cartel, and expanded its reach across most of the country and taking a lead role in trafficking drugs, including, of course, fentanyl to the U.S. So, Sandra, why don't you tell us a little bit about what CJNG is known for and El Mencho in particular?
The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, as you just mentioned, is one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico. It emerged in the late 2010 as a splinter of the Milenio cartels, which is a group that actually used to be an ally of the Sinaloa cartels. And the Jalisco New Generation Cartel first operated as an armed wing. And in fact, since its emergence, it has actually distinguished itself by its extreme and particularly public use of violence, including during a deadly turf war against Los Zeta in Veracruz in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So typically this includes the displaying of mutilated bodies of its enemy, filmed executions, or even displaying narco messages, generally with the aim of asserting its authorities both in the territories it controls, but also in the areas where it seeks to establish itself. Mencho has been one of the founders of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and I think perhaps one thing that is important to consider when we look at the Jalisco New Generation Cartels, its structure. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, especially under El Mencho, has been a fairly vertical organization. And actually, there is a very interesting studies from the Baker Institute at Rice University that use network analysis to compare the Jalisco New Generation Cartel structures from the one with the Sinaloa cartels. And what they found was particularly striking. We see that Sinaloa operates much more like a confederation with semi-autonomous factions that build alliances among themselves, so a kind of a horizontal structure, if I may say, while the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, in contrast, has shown far fewer sub-alliances and a much more stronger centralizations, so a rather top-down structures. And I think that matters because when a leader dies in a highly vertical organization, I think two things can happen. Either there's a smooth succession, meaning that the hierarchy was already established and institutionalized, or we see competitions among top commanders who were previously held together by a single central authority. And I think in the case of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the first option seems more likely, and I don't believe in a scenario similar to what happened to the Sinaloa cartel after El Mayo's arrest in July 2024, with rival factions still fighting each other until today, because of that particular vertical and control structure.
So you're referring there to the 2024 capture of the boss El Mayo, which later evolved, as you mentioned, into an all-out turf war across Sinaloa state. You're saying that you do not expect a turf war, as we saw with Sinaloa, and instead El Mencho will be replaced with a deputy or somebody in the line of succession.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's still very much early to tell. There has been a couple of analysts prospecting about who might be the successor of El Mencho. But I think really in order to to understand whether the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is going to go down the fragmentation or the consolidation path, there are several elements that we might be looking at in the near future. So if, for instance, we start seeing splinter names, internal clashes, or even narco messages that are claiming leadership over a specific area, this might actually suggest fragmentation. But if instead we see rapid or coordinated retaliations or unified messaging, then instead that would suggest consolidations. And if you ask me, again, it's still early to tell, but given the brazen violence that we have seen in the immediate aftermath of Mencho's killing, with narco roadblocks and arson attacks across the country, it seems to point to coordinated retaliations, therefore pointing to conciliation rather than fragmentation. Seems to be the path that the Jalisco New Generation is taking. Again, things might evolve, but in the near future, that's what I'm seeing.
So one of the things I noted was that in 2022, there seemed to be a total change in the geography of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, with them having much more coverage over the Mexican state. And I'm wondering, let's say in your consolidation framing, that they appoint a successor and that person continues the work of El Mencho, what kind of outside threats are likely to be coming towards the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in this time of weakness or perceived weakness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should definitely be paying close attention to how rival groups might react, especially in contested areas. And I think perhaps to develop these points, it's important to look at what happened to the Sinaloa cartel last year. We need to acknowledge that the criminal landscape in Mexico was significantly shaken by the rift within the Sinaloa cartels. So what we have seen after the arrest of Ismael El Mayo Zambada in the US in July 2024 was deadly clashes between the rival factions, Los Chapitos and El Mayo. But this rift has far greater consequences than just internal disputes. It triggered a realignment of criminal organizations in different states, including, for instance, rival groups seeking to expand territorial controls in areas under Sinaloa control. We also saw the formations of new alliances, including one that involved the Jalisco New Generation cartels that formed an alliance with one of the Sinaloa cartels faction, Los Chapito, to find La Maíza. So bearing that in mind, I think we might see a similar push with rival groups probing Jalisco New Generation cartel control area, especially in contested regions like Michoacán, Guerrero, Guanajuato, among others. And I think even if large territorial shifts really happen overnight, it's crucial to underscore that the criminal underworld, as it had operated in the past year, is currently destabilized, and that might eventually lead to heightened violence between criminal groups.
So the Sinaloa fragmentation that you referred to earlier is still showing its ramifications even now, and this is another realignment that needs to occur?
Yes, exactly. What happened essentially after the Sinaloa rift is that we have seen that in areas that were previously controlled by the Sinaloa cartel, that it has been clashes between the Sinaloa cartel's factions. But we have also seen rival criminal groups attacking the Sinaloa factions in some of their controlled states. So these territorial battles are still ongoing. And in fact, even to mention the Jalisco New Generation cartels, there has been discussion as to whether the Jalisco cartels was going to take advantage of the Sinaloa rift to expand its own territories. Now it remains to be seen, for instance, what will be the ramifications of Jalisco cartels weakening on the Sinaloa conflict, bearing in mind again that the Jalisco New Generation cartels is an ally to Los Chapitas. So there might be repercussions within the conflict, the internal conflict of the Sinaloa cartels. But again, what is going to happen with rival criminal groups seeking to expand territories where the Jalisco cartels currently operates?
So basically, there are a lot of variables at play here. There's both several types or subsets of Sinaloa, but also, of course, the positions of the Jalisco New Generation cartel across the country. In different regions, there's different constellations of actors. And there's also an uneven distribution of military action against these different constellations, right? So the outcome is truly unknown. This is quite a reckoning for the cartel system.
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned also the role that the security forces is going to play in this. And in fact, Some of the observations we have made early on after the Sinaloa cartel rift has been the increased focus of the security forces in specific regions of Mexico and how this has potentially left other states unattended and more vulnerable to criminal groups' incursions. So again, here with heightened focus on the Jalisco new generation cartels, we might also be seeing some of that. Here it's important to acknowledge the role the US administration has had on Mexico's security policies. For this specific operation, the Trump administration has stated that it was not involved militarily, but did provide intelligence about El Mencho's whereabouts. I think regardless of the level of the US participation in this particular operation, we need to recognize the impact that the US had had on Mexico's security policy. This is something that was particularly evident with Mexico's federal authority, for instance, deploying forces along the northern border shortly after Donald Trump took office. And in the same vein, we have observed a significant increase in clashes between security forces and armed groups, along with the seizures of criminal assets rightly after Trump took office. And I think this clearly marks a shift with Mexico's previous administrations under Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the so-called hugs not bullet approach. The risk there, I think what happened and the high targeted killing of El Mencho is certainly the kind of advances that the US is looking for. Whether it's going to diminish the pressure that the US is currently exerting on Mexico, I'm not sure. But so far, it looks like the President Claudia Sheinbaum has been fairly good in navigating negotiations with the US administrations. And this has come at the expense of, or at least a result of that has been heightened security operations. But I think we also need to recognize the risk that heightened pressure to conduct high-profile operation has on Mexico's security landscape. It can lead to heightened levels of violence. I mean, the kingpin or decapitation strategy has shown that it tends to trigger fragmentations and heightened violence. Again, it's contingent on the operational and hierarchical structures of each groups. But also we need to speak about the lower levels of accountabilities on military and security bodies in the name of achieving those security results. And in fact, in Mexico currently, human rights bodies have already documented abuse by Mexico security forces, including the military, the National Guards, and it adds up to recent claim by several civil society actors and search collectives that the government has actually been manipulating homicides decrease and failed to account for rising levels of forced disappearance in order to be able to show for greater security results, notably to its neighbor, the US.
That's super interesting because, as you note, there's quite a lot of reactive violence even today in response to this killing, which was intentional, is what you were saying, that they knew he was going to be there and they intended on taking him. But Mexican citizens, are they acting in the same way? Are they delighted that he is gone? Or is this simply, as you say, kind of a kingpin strategy that has an effect maybe on the stability between cartels, but less so on public security?
I don't think Mexicans are seeing an immediate result of the killing of El Mencho as a security success. I mean, currently there has been roadblocks across the countries, arson attacks against businesses. In several states, citizens have been asked to actually seek shelter in their house. So at the moment, it probably hardly looks like a progress in terms of security and being able to walk freely on the street.
So getting rid of the head does not solve security problems as I think people would hope in these contexts.
Probably not. Again, we need to see what is going to happen and also what the Mexican history has shown. Generally, decapitation strategy has brought higher levels of fragmentations, has brought heightened level of violence, and hardly were successful in dismantling a criminal organization. If anything, either an organization fragments, survives, and then divides up into several organizations. So the risk and perpetrator of violence remains there. So even on the long run, I think it's very difficult, including for Mexicans, to see this as a security achievement because it has no concrete repercussions on their daily life.
And are there other kingpins left? Are there other major heads of cartels that we should be aware of? It seems that we've gone through quite a few in the last few years. I'm just curious about whether or not other cartels have heads at the moment that are going to be pretty worried.
Well, again, I think the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa cartels are the main and most powerful criminal organizations currently in Mexico. Whether or not they were dismantled following the arrest of some of their leader or the killing of El Mencho, I don't think so. And again, perhaps we might not be seeing significant heads or kingpin at the moment, but it doesn't mean that new ones are not going to emerge as the structure essentially remains.
Do you expect the World Cup to be moved from Guadalajara, I believe, where some of the games are going to be played, or for this unrest to quieten down before that starts?
Well, I think we still need to see how the events are going to unfold in the coming weeks. Currently, given the pressure that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel is exerting through roadblocks, it seems rather compromised, and there is no guarantee that violence might cease. Again, looking back at the example of the Sinaloa cartels, Ismael Zambada was arrested in July 2024. The internal conflict between the Sinaloa cartel factions started in September 2024, and until today, there is clashes in the states of Sinaloa. Whether this is going to reproduce elsewhere in Jalisco cartels dominated area, I don't know, but it remains a possibility. Especially the tactics of using narco roadblocks is not something new. This is something that we have seen previously in the context of other security operations that has been directed against the Jalisco New Generation cartels, and that can last for several months. So again, the longevity of the Jalisco cartels remains to be seen, but I would say that it remains a threat for the organizations of the World Cup.
Sandra, I'm wondering about certain locations like Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. If you could speak to what the fear of people, both tourists and, of course, Mexican citizens are in those places going forward.
Well, I think there has been presence and activity of criminal organization in tourist areas in Mexico. We haven't necessarily seen high levels of violence because these areas also tend to be strategic assessed for those very same organized crime groups, and therefore they don't necessarily want to attract particular attentions to areas that are lucrative to them. That being said, in terms of the disruptions that we can expect, especially around those tourist areas, events are still unfolding at the moment, but we might see some level of disruptions in key logistical and routes, especially as there is narco roadblocks being organized. But again, the situation is very volatile. I think the situation still requires particular cautions, even in areas where we might not have seen high levels of organized crime violence.
Thanks so much. So the next few weeks and few months will be really important to determine whether or not it's a fragmentation strategy or a consolidation strategy on the part of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the coming areas, I think mapping criminal activities in Mexico has always been particularly difficult. Here I'm probably stating the obvious, but coming from an organization that track violent incidents is representative of a potential conflict, be that between rival criminal groups or with security forces. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a criminal organization is absent from the areas where we do not see violence. So I think the coming weeks and where we might see outbursts of violence will also be crucial in understanding where is it that the Jalisco New Generation cartels is and which are the areas that are strategically operate or important to them.
Great. Well, we'll check in a few weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I really appreciate your time. Mexico is, of course, number 4 in our ACLED conflict index, largely because of the competition between cartels. So as this situation matures, we'll check back to see whether or not it creates more violence, which I think everybody's expecting, or that violence changes somewhat in dimensions, which is also highly possible. Thank you.
You've been listening to Conflicts of Interest, brought to you by ACLED, with Professor Clionadh Raleigh and Dr. Caitriona Dowd. New episodes are available every fortnight. Follow ACLED socials for more in the meantime.